You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world tonight. The Eighth Sphere, building a digital hell. Tonight we're going to talk about a very interesting topic. You may have heard of the Eighth Sphere. Now, this is a concept that has been present in occultism for a very long time, but known to a very select few up until the year 1883, when it was released in a book titled Esoteric Buddhism by a gentleman whose last name was Sinnett. And it was in this work that this concept was largely revealed to the public for the first time. And we can learn a few things from Rudolf Steiner about this, which is primarily where we're going to be reading from tonight, to give you a look into what it is that this concept known as the Eighth Sphere encompasses and how it relates to the world we're living in today and what it is that we've talked about here in the past as related to another concept known to the Hermeticists as the world of shells. That is essentially one and the same with this entire concept of the Eighth Sphere, and we're going to dig deep tonight, and we're going to delve heavily into this concept, and we'll try to paint a picture for you. We'll try to give you a framework of observation to work from in the philosophical viewpoint of this. I'll try to give some context to many of the things that Steiner talks about in a lecture we'll be reading from, talking about the occult movement in the 19th century. This is lecture number 5, was given at Dornach, Switzerland in 1915 on October the 18th by Rudolf Steiner himself, and it is recorded for posterity for all of us. You can find much of Rudolf Steiner's work on Rudolf Steiner Archive, which is actually easy to find online these days, and that's a good thing. We need more resources like this. Steiner had a lot of interesting thoughts. He contributed an awful lot to the understanding in the modern era of many things on the spiritual side. And he can give more context into what has happened within the auspices of the occult community itself, within the auspices of the occult fraternities, the secret society groups, and all of these various organizations that bring forward the secret doctrine into the modern era, and how much of what they teach is wrong and inverted from what the original intention has been. And Steiner is one of the select few that I find that has pointed this out. You see, he learned under these various groups. He was a student of Rosicrucianism as well as Theosophy, and he found some problems in much of what they were bringing forward. He saw the contradictions inherent in what they were teaching, and he saw the obvious agendas that were being played out in front of his eyes with much of this occult information. Now, like I said, Steiner, I don't think he was always on the right side of things, but I think he realized after having studied under many of these different systems for a long time that he was on the wrong side, and then towards the end, he really began to make some inroads to try to make corrections to a lot of what's been presented. And I think he's done a great job in outlining ideas. Now, as I always caution you, you have to be able to use your discernment to sort out the good from the bad, take away what is valuable, and discard that which is not valuable or that which you find to be untrue or incorrect. Now, everybody has their own inherent biases, and Steiner was no different, but he had a really good overall view of a lot of different things, in my opinion, anyway. And I think this is valuable insight that we can learn something from. That's why we are presenting it here tonight. So, the Eighth Sphere. You've probably heard of this, and there are many misconceptions about this. And we're going to get into some of the details here. So, starting out with the lecture, Steiner says, "It is very difficult indeed to speak about the so-called Eighth Sphere. which was referred to openly for the first time by Mr. Sinnett, and as I had alluded to earlier, that was in an 1883 publication called Esoteric Buddhism that took on a lot of popularity within the theosophical groups and various other of the occult fraternities, and he misrepresented some things. Let's put it that way. So let's get back to what Steiner says about this. So he says that the eighth sphere was openly referred to for the first time in this work by Mr. Sinnett. Before that, it was only known to a very select few within the highest most echelons of many of these occult orders, and it was something that was scarcely understood. Let's read on here. So Steiner says, one cannot say that he gave information about it, for what he said was a fallacy. You can certainly realize why it is difficult to speak about this subject, for again, it must be emphasized that our language has been coined for the outer material world, and the eighth sphere was regarded as a secret matter until it was mentioned by Sinnett. Going to pause for a moment. So as I had said earlier, there were only a very select few within the highest most echelons of these various occult fraternities and secret society groups that had any inkling about this notion of the eighth sphere, what it was, what it represented, and where it was going. And we're going to touch on all of that here tonight. This is a very important broadcast, ladies and gentlemen. And maybe you have some groundwork to be done to catch up to some of the concepts we're going to speak about here, but I will try to offer you some insight and context to it so it all makes sense to you. Because that's the most important thing to me, is being able to convey the message here in a concise way where it makes sense to you, where you understand in layman's terms, in plain language, the importance of the information being conveyed here and how it relates to our time. This isn't something from the past, for the past. This is important right now. So let's read on. Consequently, there are not many words that can be used for characterizing the eighth sphere. The fact that all mention was avoided for so long will also enable you to realize what is involved when one speaks of it. You will therefore have to take the aphoristic remarks I shall make today as a kind of introductory exposition, given with the object of throwing out certain indications which, to begin with, can be only a small contribution to the subject. It is to be hoped, however, that there will be opportunities for saying more at some later time, on the basis of what was said in Steiner's previous lecture from this one, and also to some extent on some earlier occasions. Steiner says he shall try to characterize what is called the eighth sphere in order that we may have a foundation for describing the development of the spiritual movement in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th. And I'm going to pause for a moment. Now, this was a very critical time in our history. You may have heard me mention in the past, if you've been a listener for a long time, something important happened in the mid to late 1800s in the auspices of the occult community, within the occult fraternities and the secret societies, within the inner organizations of those who know some things. There was a switch over in the modern era. This is when things began to take a turn. Now, Steiner pinned this down to a spiritual battle that happened in the spiritual realms beginning in 1841 and ending in 1879. And we see the ramifications of that being mirrored in the physical world today. So this is what's being alluded to in some regards here. But it was an important switchover point in that period, in the mid to late 1800s. We see a lot of different doctrines taking shape. We see a lot of different esoteric information hitting the mainstream for the first time in thousands of years, really, in all actuality. And at least since the rise of the Rosicrucians in the 1600s, we see in the mid-1800s this arisal of information, spiritual information as well as scientific information. You see, there was a big upcycling of human consciousness at that time, and things began to happen in the world that needed further explanations. And people began to think in more concrete ways and were able to envision things in different ways. And we had a type of a renaissance of sorts, a secondary renaissance during that time, wherein knowledge increased exponentially from that time forward. And that's what one of the things is here that Steiner is speaking about. And this was an important phase in our modern era for our understanding to take hold. And this, in this same time period, arising in the late 1800s, 1883 to be exact, this notion of the eighth sphere took prominence and came forward into the auspices of the occult community of that time. And it was something that they talked about, and there were many misconceptions bandied about, and many misunderstandings, and Steiner seemed to know something about it that others didn't, and he's going to point out those things here. So we have this development of this spiritual movement in the late 1800s and going into the early 1900s. At the turn of the century, there was a very popular notion of seances and various other spiritual things like that going on. And a lot of this had its place in the popular culture at that time. And this is what Steiner's alluding to, and there was a purpose to this, as we will see. So let's get back to the reading. So Steiner says, we have realized that the eighth sphere cannot be anything that belongs to the material world. For Steiner says he has shown that the great fallacy in Mr. Sinnett's statement is that the physical moon is directly connected with the eighth sphere, and Steiner says he tried to make it comprehensible that the actual foundation of the error consists in the fact that this pointed to something material and physical. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. Now, this is one of the misconceptions attached to this notion of the eighth sphere, that it somehow or another relates to the moon, the physical moon in the sky that we are familiar with, the satellite of the Earth, the moon. Well, a lot of this comes from this publication on esoteric Buddhism by this Mr. Sinnett, and was popularized through the Theosophical Society. They attached the notion of the moon actually being the eighth sphere. And this, in and of itself, has carried forward into the modern era in ways most people don't even realize. How so, you may ask? Well, all you have to do is look at the modern conception of what we know today as ufology, or the ufology movement, and you'll understand there's always been this association made with the moon, the physical moon, where they say that the aliens have a hidden base on the backside of the moon that captures the souls of human beings as they exit the physical life here. This is what's said. This has been talked about in the ufology circles for a long, long time. You could probably still find some old lectures given by John Lear speaking of such things. This is a notion that has cropped up in the ufology community for a long time. This is the source of that, ladies and gentlemen, so you understand. This is the source. As I always tell you, whether I like it or I don't, and I don't like it, it always ties back to the occult every single time, and it's no different with this. That whole notion that the aliens, the little gray aliens, have some type of a base on the backside of the moon that collects human souls as they leave this realm comes directly from this connotation of the eighth sphere, this misunderstanding that was promulgated by the Theosophical Society back in the 1880s. There's nothing new under the sun. Just so you understand, it's just all been rebranded to fit our modern scientific way of thinking for our modern sensibilities. It's all a repackaging of the same things that have always been extant here. The spiritual side is the important side. But that's not the side they want you to see. They want you to focus on the physical, and we'll get to the reasons why as we move on here. So anyway, Sinnett made a statement that the physical moon is directly connected to the eighth sphere. Steiner says, nuh-uh, that's not correct. He says it can't be pointed to something that is material and physical. Now let's continue and see what else Rudolf Steiner can reveal to us about this notion that is known as the eighth sphere. From this, you will be able to conjecture, even if not fully to understand, that what is called the eighth sphere can have nothing directly to do with anything within the material world. That is to say, what can be perceived by man's senses and thought out on the basis of sensory perception has no part in the eighth sphere. So it will be useless to look for the eighth sphere anywhere in the material world. Gonna pause for a moment. So now Steiner is telling us it is not a physical object. It is not something that can be physically detected by our five senses. It's not something you can touch and feel and look at and know something about in this way. That's not what the eighth sphere is. You can't look in the sky and say, hey, that object up there is the eighth sphere. That is the representation of the eighth sphere. That's not a correct assumption to make. Now, we'll get into why it is that the Theosophists in particular gave out the misunderstanding that the moon has a connection to the eighth sphere. We'll get into the reasons why. But let's continue and see what else Steiner can tell us. He says, you now have indications by means of which some approach can be made in thought to a conception of the eighth sphere. I have said that the eighth sphere has something to do with the residue left from the old moon and its evolution. I'm going to pause for a moment before we continue here. What is Steiner talking about here? The old moon. Well, you see, I'll lay down a little bit of foundation. In the Rosicrucian cosmoconception, there are cycles of evolution that man has gone through, according to what they say, and that Earth has gone through, and the previous cycle is referred to as the moon period, or the old moon. Now, it was something that was very different than existence is today, according to the Rosicrucian cosmoconception. The world operated under different natural laws at that point, and it was a more etheric form. It was not as dense. It did not exist in the dense chemical region, as the Rosicrucians call it today. It was more of an etheric state that this moon period had existed within. So just to lay the foundation, so you understand, according to the Rosicrucians, it begins with the Saturn period, moves forward to the Sun period, then the Moon period, then the Earth period, which is the period we are in right now. We are halfway through that. There are 7 different periods, or cycles of evolution, through which all of manifestation goes, according to the Rosicrucians. Now next would be the Jupiter cycle, and then beyond that, the Venus cycle and the Vulcan cycle. Those are the 7 cycles in the Rosicrucian cosmoconception. We are at the bottommost level right now in the physical, dense chemical region of the Earth period. So these different periods, this could get confusing for people a lot of times because they are represented by other objects that we have in the sky. The same names are applied to these objects in the sky that were applied to these cycles of evolution, but they're 2 entirely different things. So when Steiner's speaking of the old moon, he's not speaking about that physical object we see in the sky. That is not the moon he's referring to. He's referring to the moon period. It was a previous iteration of the existence of mankind and of all creation in a different manifestation. And this is very hard to wrap your brain around, because you have to think philosophically. The Earth was different. It was a different iteration of the Earth. It existed in a different time period, had different operational laws of nature that functioned, and man was a microcosm of that as well. But he was in a less evolved state where he didn't take on full physical manifestation as yet. He only had etheric manifestation at that time. Now, all of this gets very confusing for anybody who is new to this way of thinking, but I am doing my utmost to try to simplify it for you. So, this is where we get the notion of these various spheres of evolution. That's right, evolution. Evolution is a much older idea than Charles Darwin. For anybody who's a new listener, and maybe you haven't followed along with what we're speaking of, but we have this notion that we go through these cycles of evolution, these periods of evolution, these spheres of evolution, as they are called by some, and that is how Steiner refers to them. So the old moon sphere was the previous iteration from this one. We are in the fourth phase right now, the Earth sphere. So the old moon was the previous cycle, not to be confused with the physical object we see in the sky. This is where a lot of people get it wrong. This is where people begin looking down all the wrong rabbit trails to understand what is being conferred in the language of symbology by the esotericists and by the occultists. So when you have people talking about the Saturn-Moon matrix, and they're looking at the planet Saturn and they're looking at the physical moon, they have it wrong. That's not what's being referenced at all. Although the language they're using may be correct symbolically, they are not looking in the right place for the answers. That's where we're here to try to clear the air. So anyway, Steiner says that he tried to make it clear in a previous lecture he'd given. On the old moon, man's natural mode of perception was visionary and imaginative in character, so that any substantiality to be discerned in the eighth sphere must be found with this kind of vision. That is to say, it must be presumed at the outset that the eighth sphere is found by way of visionary imaginations. Gonna pause for a moment here. So you cannot conceptualize or see the eighth sphere with your physical senses. You cannot detect it with your physical senses. This is something that he calls visionary imaginations that are necessary in order to conceive of this. So this is something a lot deeper, more philosophical, has to do with the inner life of man rather than the outer life of man, the internal rather than the external. You can perceive through spiritual senses some of what is present in this concept of the eighth sphere. So it's only through this visionary imagination that it can be conceived of. So how was it that the expression eighth sphere came to be used? You know that human evolution takes its course through the seven spheres of Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, Jupiter, Venus, and Vulcan. We will conceive that besides these seven spheres, there is still something else which lies outside of them, and yet is in some way related to the Earth. Here, then, we have a sphere visible only to visionary imaginative clairvoyance, which stands there as an eighth sphere, over and above the seven which constitute the domain of the ordered and regular evolution of mankind. Gonna pause for a moment here. So now you know why it's called the eighth sphere. You see, according to the old occult sciences and the various secret doctrines put forward, we go through these seven spheres of evolution. Well, this eighth sphere somehow has a very weak attachment to the Earth sphere that we are currently in at the bottom of the rung. And Steiner gives diagrams showing this, where each sphere of evolution, as it's described, goes in a stepping down process to Earth and then back up to Vulcan on the other side. So it begins at Saturn, descends down one stage at a time through the Sun, through the Moon, to the Earth, and then back up to Jupiter, then Venus, and then Vulcan in a V shape. So picture 7 circles in a V shape. The Earth is the bottom of the V. The eighth sphere is a circle just beneath the circle of the Earth in the V, and it somehow overlaps the Earth. And this is an abomination to the natural order. That's essentially what's being presented here. Now, Steiner says all such sketches are, of course, purely diagrammatic. One is obliged to draw separately spheres which can only be observed each within the others. For you will certainly have realized from our studies that as long as man is within the material world, makes his observations through the senses, and thinks with the intellect, he is standing in the fourth sphere, also called the earth sphere. If he develops his faculties of soul sufficiently to be able to see the third sphere, also called the moon sphere, then he takes a far flight, but not in the spatial sense. He observes not from another place, but physically speaking, spatially speaking, from the same place. These 7 spheres ought therefore in reality to be drawn within one another. They are successive stages and states of evolution, and fundamentally such a diagram is of no other value than as if one were to say human beings develop from birth to the 7th year in a first stage, from the 7th to the 14th year in a second stage, and so on. The being who has developed from the 1st to 7th year cannot be thought of as separate from the being who is developing from the 7th until the 14th year. Neither is it correct to think of the 7 successive spheres or stages of the Earth's evolution as separate from each other. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So the way Steiner outlines this is he uses the law of analogy, and he compares it to this very real notion of the development of a human being. We go through various cycles or stages in our lives. These are 7-year stages. And there's a reason for this, and the occultists of old knew about this, and medical science is only now beginning to just catch up with this idea. So we have various developmental things that happen in our bodies from the years between birth and 7 years old. Then from 7 to 14, other changes take place, and from 14 to 21, etc., on and on it goes through these different developmental cycles. But it would be incorrect to say that the 6-year-old is not the same as the 14-year-old when it's the same person you're talking about. So if you have a child, it's the same child when they were 6. They have different physical characteristics by the time they're 14, but it would be incorrect to claim they're 2 different people, or to claim that they're 2 separate things. You see, one is a correspondence to the other, exists within the other. That's the important concept here. So if we recognize that one exists within the other, it stands to reason to understand that this moon sphere exists within the earth sphere. It was an older iteration of the evolutionary process of man. And if you look at this corresponding to the various phases of growth and development in the life of man, you could understand a little better. This is the law of correspondence in the Hermetic principles involved here. You could use the law of analogy to make the connection. So Steiner says the same thing. So he says even though they represent these diagrams for students to show these 7 different phases, these 7 circles as they draw them in the V shape, that's not how they actually look in the real world. They all exist within one another. They all interpenetrate one another, much like the spiritual realms interpenetrate the physical realm and vice versa. We've gone through some of this notion in the past. It's all present right here, right now. Remember that song, Right Here, Right Now? You thought it was just a clever play on lyrics, and it was only about a certain period of time in your youth, but you were mistaken. It transcends all of that. Right here, right now. This is what's going on. This is what it's all about. All of these different spheres exist right here, right now, within and around us and throughout us. But we lack the senses to detect them. Steiner refers to these as the supersensible worlds. Our past evolution is a part of us, as our future evolution is a part of us as well. Time is a physical construct related to this earth sphere that we are in. It's one of the natural laws that permeates in this Earth sphere. Doesn't affect some of the other spheres, though. That's an interesting distinction to make as well. But I want to get back to the main focus here. I want to get back to the reading. So Steiner says this will give you an inkling that the eighth sphere is to be observed within the Earth sphere. It cannot properly be drawn either above or below to depict the reality. It would have to be sketched into the Earth sphere. I have often given a crude example to express what is here meant. Just as the physical air is around us, so is the spiritual around us. We have to look for the spiritual within what is actually physical in our environment. Hence, it must be presumed that just as the spiritual is round about us, so we must also look for the eighth sphere in our environment. This means that an organ enabling man to perceive the eighth sphere would have to be developed, just as his physical senses enable him to perceive the material earth. He could then experience the eighth sphere quite consciously, but unconsciously he is always within it, just as we are always within the air, even if we are not aware of it. And if we have developed an organ for experiencing the eighth sphere, we are conscious of it around us. So that if the eighth sphere is to be described, it must obviously be described as a realm in which we are living all the time. And I'm going to pause for a moment. So Steiner is speaking of the development of a type of sensory organ to detect this eighth sphere. Now think about the connotation here, once again using the law of analogy to compare it to the air. We know the air is around us. We don't see it. We don't detect it except by how it affects physical things in our environment. You could see the tree branches blowing in the wind. That is an effect of the air. That is the only way we could perceive the air. It's always around us, but we don't always see it. The same is said of this eighth sphere. It's present. We exist in this field all the time. Think in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum radiations that are always around about us that we don't perceive with our five senses. Same kind of connotation involved here. The eighth sphere is something consistent with that. Now, he speaks of the development of sensory organs to detect the eighth sphere. Well, wouldn't you know? We have all of these advanced technologies today, and they are actually building a digital sub-layer of this reality. This corresponds directly to this eighth sphere. Look at the technologies known as virtual reality and augmented reality. These are not physical objects in existence, much like the moon, as described by the Theosophists, being the eighth sphere. That's not the case. What we have instead is this invisible world around us, which is the eighth sphere. It's the digital sublayer they are building all around us right now. It is taking shape. It has been here for a long time. There are spirits and essences and things that manifest within this eighth sphere and have been for a long time. But now they're building the technology to actually tap into this. And it's a dangerous situation, and it's something that very few people are actually even thinking about. It's the ghost in the machine, ladies and gentlemen. It is present. This is what's happening. This corresponds directly with what the Hermeticists call the world of shells. It's being built right now. We'll give you more context as we read more of what Steiner tells us. So let's continue. So Steiner says all that he can do in these introductory studies is to give us somewhat general information about this. The rest will emerge as we proceed. He says, first of all, you can understand that what is around us as the eighth sphere is accessible to imaginative visionary clairvoyance. To develop imaginative clairvoyance without perceiving something of the eighth sphere is impossible. The reason why it is so difficult to speak of matters such as the eighth sphere is because really clear and discriminative clairvoyance is possessed by so very few. In the eighth sphere, we have to do with imaginations and what constitutes the essential nature of Earth evolution. That is to say, the fourth sphere is not present in the eighth sphere. I'm going to pause for a moment here. So now think about this. And this is wherein the eighth sphere differs from the rest of the seven spheres as presented here by the Rosicrucian system. He's telling us the fourth sphere does not exist within the eighth sphere, but the eighth sphere exists within the fourth sphere. It's separate from the natural evolutionary process. It's something different. It's something wholly synthetic and artificial. It doesn't belong here. It's an abomination to the natural order of things. Let's read on. The essential nature of the fourth sphere is constituted, as indicated in previous lectures by Steiner, by the mineral impregnation of this world body. That we are able to live on the earth is due to the fact that this fourth sphere has been mineralized. We live in a mineralized environment. What is perceived through the physical senses can be coordinated by the intellect, but we must conceive that the mineral element is totally absent from the eighth sphere. So now I'm going to pause for another moment here. So now what he's telling us, to correspond this back to the Rosicrucian system, the mineralized nature of the Earth sphere. This is what the Rosicrucians refer to as the dense chemical region of our physical reality. This is what he's speaking of. We have actual physical material world objects, things, people we could sense with our five senses and detect here. That's not present in the eighth sphere. It is purely imaginative. Think of the digital world. It's purely imaginative. There is not a physical thing extant in the digital world. Are you beginning to make the correspondences? Can you see the picture clearly now? Are you understanding what is being built by this beast system? How the internet and everything else ties into it, how the Web 3.0 technologies all bind together within this. The metaverse ideology, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, augmented reality. They're tapping into a spiritual concept that is an abomination to the natural order of things. This is what's going on, and it's a very dangerous situation. You see, the whole digital realm pre-exists the modern era. We're just now beginning to tap into it. It's something entirely different than what you've been taught, or what you think. The Matrix is real, ladies and gentlemen, but the Matrix is this digital eighth sphere. That's what's being built. We'll get into that a little more, into what the connotations of this are in a moment. But let's get back to what Steiner has to say. When we eliminate the mineral element in thought, all that remains is a later stage of the old moon evolution, for whence could anything else originate? But evolution proceeds, something that is perceptible through imaginative visionary clairvoyance, but could be nothing else than a residue of the old moon. That would be no eighth sphere. All that could be said would be that something has been left behind by the third sphere, or the moon sphere. Going to pause for a moment. So now we're talking about a residual form of third sphere matter being left behind, something being left behind in this moon sphere, this era of evolution, this process, this time before what we could perceive as our modern world, what we know about this universe, a previous iteration of it. There was something left over. Now let's proceed with the reading. In order to have some inkling of the facts relating to the eighth sphere, let us keep the following in mind. In the course of its regular evolution, the third sphere became the fourth sphere, that is to say, a transition of the third elemental kingdom, for that is what we must call it, to the mineral kingdom took place. The mineral element was added. Otherwise, we should have to conceive of the old moon as a sum total of substantiality, imaginatively perceptible. It must therefore be assumed that the regular possession from the old moon to the earth, from the third sphere to the fourth sphere, consists in what was formerly only imaginatively perceptible, becoming materially perceptible, that is to say, becoming mineralized. And I'm going to pause for a moment. So essentially what Steiner is conveying to us is this previous existence, this third sphere existence, this moon phase existence, was an etheric existence. It didn't have physical materiality present within it. It was an imaginative type of perception. It was an illusion to us in our ways of thinking. Let's put it that way. It was almost like a dreamlike existence. It was not a physical existence. It was an etheric existence, and we've gone into this distinction here in the past that this physical plane on which we reside and we are familiar with consists of two separate layers. We have the dense chemical region, which we are familiar with, this physicality, physical material existence with matter that we perceive with our five senses, and there is an etheric portion of this physical plane. The etheric is the density at which the moon period existed. Man existed in the etheric state at that time, and eventually, through the process of natural evolution, through the cycles of time, and through this process, it evolved into this fourth sphere, this earth sphere, and became mineralized and densified into this dense chemical region. I hope this is making sense to you. I'm trying to express these same ideologies as they are presented from the different systems of occultism. They all agree on these same precepts. They may call them different things or use different terms to describe them, but it's all describing the very same thing. So it was a type of a stepping down process in the evolutionary process where we stepped into physical materialization from the etheric version thereof in the previous form. So, keeping that in mind, as the eighth sphere there remains, to begin with, the old moon element, but owing to a particular happening, this old moon element undergoes a change. What took place, in order that the fourth sphere may be able to arise from the third sphere, is clearly described in Steiner's book, Occult Science, where it is said that the activities of the spirits of movement are added to those of the spirits of form, under whose guidance the whole process of the transformation takes place. We can therefore say that the fourth sphere arises out of the third sphere through the facts that the spirits of form add their activities to those of the spirits of movement. And I'm going to pause for a moment here. Once again, Steiner is referencing back to the Rosicrucian cosmoconception, wherein it is taught that there are various spiritual hierarchies that perform different functions in the evolutionary cycles of man and of the earth. And he's speaking of these spirits of form and these spirits of movement. The spirits of movement were present in the moon phase, and added to them were the spirits of form, beginning their work to bring about the densification of the fourth sphere. That's what's being related to here. If the spirits of form had achieved everything that their own nature desires, and moreover is able to achieve, when the mission of Sphere 3 was fulfilled in the cosmos, Sphere 4 would have arisen quite naturally from Sphere 3. That is obvious, but we know that luciferic and ahrimanic spirits are at work, and they hold back for themselves something of the old moon substantiality, wrested away, as it were, from the spirits of form. Gonna pause for a moment. Now we're getting to the meat of the matter here, ladies and gentlemen. Now we can understand a little something about what all of this notion of the eighth sphere entails. The fact that Lucifer and Ahriman do so is indicative of their essential nature. Thus, as Sphere 3 is advancing to a further stage, something is wrested from the spirits of form by Lucifer and Ahriman. Into this part that is wrested away, Lucifer and Ahriman penetrate, instead of the spirits of form. The activities of Lucifer and Ahriman are added to those of the spirits of movement, and as a result, 8 arises out of 3. Gonna pause for a moment. The 8th sphere arises out of the 3rd sphere and loosely attaches itself to the 4th sphere. You see, according to what is presented here, these spirits of form helped to densify this moon sphere so that it became the later iteration that we are in now, known as the Earth sphere. But there was remnants left of some of the energies or processes of this moon sphere that were hijacked by who Steiner identifies here as the spirits of Lucifer and Ahriman. So Steiner identifies Ahriman and Lucifer as being these two spirits, one representing physical, Ahriman, one representing spiritual, Lucifer. In my view, these are two sides of the same coin. They are one and the same. This is what I would identify as the spirit of Antichrist, the polarized spirit of Antichrist. Ahriman, Lucifer. Now, I differ on Steiner's point of view in that way, but this is how he identifies it, and this is from his own particular bias or point of view or perspective. I have a different perspective, but I agree with his overall assessment, and that's the thing. We can have differences of opinion on the minutia of detail with some of these things, but when you come to the same basic conclusions about this, that's the important part. So now Steiner tells us it's because of this work of this Ahrimanic Luciferic force that something was wrested away from this moon sphere when the Earth sphere began to materialize here, began to densify and come into existence in the here and now where we are. So he says, something else, then, must be there, not merely the old moon, and this something else which comes into being as well as Sphere 4, or the Earth sphere, is constituted by the fact that mineral substantiality, as it comes into being, is wrested away at the moment of the birth of the 4th sphere. Thus, when the mineral comes into existence out of the imaginative substantiality, it is snatched by Lucifer and Ahriman and made into imagination. Instead of an earth arising from the remaining old moon substantiality, a cosmic body takes shape whose birth is due to the fact that the substantiality wrested from the earth is made into what has come over from the old moon. Gonna pause for a moment. So now part of this mineralization process performed by these spirits of form in the densification of this world, this sphere, from the moon sphere into the Earth sphere, something is wrested away by this Ahrimanic Luciferic force. Part of this mineralization process, they've collected some of this to build something entirely different. Now recall, Steiner says he described the conditions pertaining to the old moon in his book, The Occult Science. In the old moon, there was as yet nothing mineral. Had mineral substance been present, that world body would have been an earth, not moon. Sphere 4 comes into being through the birth of the mineral element. In that, Lucifer and Ahriman approach, snatch mineral substantiality out of Sphere 4, and infuse it into Sphere 3. The old moon is recapitulated, but now with materiality that belongs properly to the earth. Gonna pause for a moment here, and I hope I could express this and explain this in a way that makes sense. So essentially what happened is, in the natural evolutionary process, the 4th sphere arises from the 3rd sphere. But what has happened is, due to the activity of these spirits of form that bring about this mineralization into the fourth sphere, a portion of that was hijacked by this Ahrimanic Luciferic force to build something else, a type of a pocket dimension, for lack of a better term, that sits at a nexus point here with the fourth sphere, with Earth. And this is called the eighth sphere. They are taking this process of the densification or mineralization of this etheric matter into physicality. They've taken that energy, siphoned it off to a type of a sub-region of this third phase, this third sphere, this moon sphere. And they're building something imaginative with it. Like I said, essentially, they've taken a portion of the moon sphere, broken it off to build a pocket dimension of sorts. That's probably the best analogy or best way of thinking about it that I could express to you as to what this is. And I know this is probably a bridge too far for many people out there, but stick with me, because this is important. It's a different way of thinking. You have to really have an overall philosophical view of things. Go back to the older natural sciences, the ways of thinking of our ancestors, of the Hermeticists, of the alchemists, of those who actually knew a little something about the natural world. These are the ideas that are expressed in much of the esoterica and occultism that has been present from time immemorial, passed down within the secret doctrine to those within the auspices of some of these occult fraternities and secret society groups through the course of time, and only known by a select few at the highest most echelons. There's not a lot of this that is largely understood by most people in the modern era, and it is only through deep diving like this into these various subjects that you can garner just a basic understanding of some of this. And I hope I'm not losing you out there. So essentially, they've taken a portion of this moon period and they've lagged behind in their evolutionary process with this, and they're taking some of the substance of this evolutionary process here in this Earth period and applying that to this third moon period to build something new, something unnatural, something wholly synthetic that does not belong in this natural evolutionary process of things, this natural existence. It is an abomination to nature. It is called the eighth sphere. Let's get back to the reading here, and we'll see what else Steiner can tell us. And then I'll begin to connect some more dots for you. Mark this well. Instead of pure imaginations being there, the imaginations are densified by the infusion of a mineral element that has been wrested from the earth. Densified imaginations are thus created. We are therefore drawn into a world of densified imaginations which are not lunar in character because they have been densified by materiality belonging to the earth. They are ghosts, specters, that is to say, behind our world there is a world of specters created by Lucifer and Ahriman. Gonna pause for a moment here. An illusory world, a fantasy world, a world wherein spirits dwell, that is a nexus between this third sphere and the fourth sphere, a pocket dimension, if you will. This is the definition of hell. We'll add a little more context as we go. Let me express it schematically as follows. On the old moon, certain pictures were present. These should have passed over to the earth as something everywhere perceptible. But Lucifer and Ahriman retained them for themselves. Lucifer and Ahriman wrested from the earth certain of its constituents and made them into imaginations so that these earth substances became not earthly formations, but moon formations. Into our fourth sphere, therefore, there has been instilled a sphere that is really a moon sphere, but is filled with earthly substantiality, and is therefore a bogus creation in the universe. To the seven spheres, an eighth created in opposition to the progressive spirits has been added. The necessary consequence of this is that the spirits of form must do battle on the earth for every morsel of substantiality capable of mineralization, lest it should be wrested from them by Lucifer and Ahriman and born into the eighth sphere. Gonna pause for a moment here. So now Steiner essentially reaffirms what I had said earlier. This eighth sphere is an abomination to the natural order. That's what he has revealed here. He calls it a bogus creation in the universe. And it is all about the inversion principle. Understand that. In truth, therefore, our earth, the fourth sphere, is simply not what it appears outwardly to be. Were it really to consist of atoms, all these atoms would still be impregnated by formations belonging to the eighth sphere, which are perceptible only to visionary clairvoyance. These formations are present everywhere, so too is the spectre-like content of the eighth sphere, which can therefore be perceived just as actual spectres are perceived. All earthly being and existence are involved here. Lucifer and Ahriman strive unceasingly to draw from the earth's substances whatever they can snatch in order to form their eighth sphere, which then, when it is sufficiently advanced, will be detached from the earth and go its own way in the cosmos together with Lucifer and Ahriman. Needless to say, the earth would then pass over to Jupiter as a mere torso. But man, as you realize, has his established place in the whole of Earth evolution, for he is mineralized through and through. We are permeated by the mineralizing process, which is itself drawn into this battle, so that morsels of this substance can be continually wrested from it. Therefore, we ourselves are involved in the battle. Lucifer and Ahriman battle against the spirits of form with the aim of wresting mineral substance from us everywhere. Going to pause for a moment. So now Steiner is telling us something even more important here. He's telling us that this illusory world around us overlaps with this eighth sphere notion of things. The eighth sphere, they are attempting to build this world of shells. This has everything to do with the concept of hyper-materialism. That is what the eighth sphere consists of. It's the spiritual attitude of hyper-materialism bound up in this digital sub-layer that is being built, this manifestation of a reality that's not really a reality, it's an illusion. And of course, he's saying that this physical existence, this mineralization that has occurred, it's not what it was originally intended to be. This constitutes the same notion as original sin, if you want to get back to the correspondences here. Our physical existence that we are familiar with, this material world existence we exist in, it is not completely as it was intended. There's something missing. There's a bit of substance missing from it that has been hijacked by what he calls Lucifer and Ahriman here, which in my view are the same essence, the same spiritual form, just two opposite opposing polarities of it at work. And what has happened is we have this overlapping of this fourth sphere reality in which we live with this eighth sphere reality, and it's going to split at some point. And those who are more spiritually minded will advance to this Jupiter phase next, and there will be others that are left behind in this Earth phase, and still another sub-layer of that, wherein some will get wholly caught up in this eighth sphere. And this is the most frightening prospect of all. I hope you're following along here. I know it's easy to get lost on this, and it's very hard to understand in our modern scientific viewpoint of thinking. But he's also telling us we're all part of this battle. It's a spiritual battle. And there's no sitting on the sidelines. There's no escaping it. We all are forced to participate. We all have a choice to make. Each and every one of us has an individual choice to make at the end of the day. There's no avoiding this. There's no sitting on the sidelines or sitting on the fence with any of this. You will make a choice. What choice you make is your prerogative. But understand the consequences of the choices. So anyway, that's all the time we have for tonight. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I want to remind you I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll catch you next time. Have a good one now.